I'm Natalie Hester in Romance Languages, and I get to now take a little bit of Leah's role because now I get to introduce her, as director of the Oregon Humanities Center. She gets to introduce the guests, so I get to occupy that spot for just a little bit. And I'm just going to say a couple of things. But it's clear here from the crowd that you have this ability to bring people together that's really wonderful. And I think you will show us that your book is about that as well, poetry and community in some way, not only. So Professor Leah Middlebrook is interested in poetry and poetics, early modern translation, and theories of the subject, poetry, poesis, and also quite a bit of Cervantes, as we will hear about today. And I'll just say a couple of things. Leah Middlebrook is so many things, and I think of what you have done in your career and what you're doing now as director of the Oregon Humanities Center is kind of occupying kind of as a force for good. And I think we're here for that as well because you represent that, not only to hear sort of your wonderful, wonderful close readings that you do, and your theorizing about poesis and the subject. I'll mention just a couple of things that Leah Middlebrook has won both of the most distinguished teaching awards offered at the University of Oregon, the Ersted Award for junior faculty and the Herman Award for senior faculty, and was also had such an important role as president for the Society for Renaissance and Baroque Hispanic Poetry, where she was president for 4 years and stepped down recently. And I'm peripheral to that organization just because I see the interactions at conferences. So I just wanted to mention at the most recent Renaissance Society of the America meeting in Boston in March, I got to see once again Leah Middlebrook mentoring a junior colleague about books and publications, all the while, sharing a beer. And I think that's so much of what you do, that your generosity is really visible on so many levels. And I think that, we're gathered today, it's also to hear about ideas of poetry, community, everyday practice. And just to have a kind of a safe space from everything else out there to talk about these amazing topics that you explain and illustrate and read so well. So I guess we clap for Professor Middlebrook. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Natalie. And it's just so much fun also, just kind of like, I don't know what baseball is, but I think that it's inside baseball to be looking at faces in this room and remembering when we all published our first books. And so it's beyond meaningful to have you introduce me. So thank you. And because we've come to that time, I have to put my glasses on. So thank you for the introduction, but also thank you for making this event happen, and thank you for this series. Natalie's been running the most wonderful series for Romance Languages where we're celebrating the publications of people's books, and they're just glorious, really. These events are really, really glorious, and they're a tremendous amount of work, so thank you for doing that work. And I was also, I smiled at some of your introductory comments because I'm going in the same direction. It means a lot to have the opportunity today to talk about Amphion with everyone, but it also means a lot to me to be able to thank all the people. Oh, I do this. I get very emo. To thank the many people in RL and Colt who helped make this book happen. So I'm going to read some names. Lainey Millar, Fabian Moore, Michael Allen, all of whom read pages any time of day or night and would turn them around almost immediately. Michael Allen was also the king of the panicked midnight text message. If you ever need to send such a message, I recommend my colleague, Michael Allen. And then Warren Ginsberg and Gina Saki, who introduced me to, or who helped me understand Amphion in Dante, and your help was, matchless, peerless. Cecilia Enjuto Rangel, who introduced me to Raul Zurita's poetry when we had the opportunity to teach RL 623 together. Ken Calhoun, Harry Wanham, Alejandro Vallega. There was ongoing, steady, all-time encouragement from Natalie Hester and from Michael Stern, who with Sarah Grew fed me meals and kept me company in the throes of revision. Ditto Robert Davis. Ryan Walker, who read my page proofs, and I will be endlessly grateful because I couldn't even read my own prose at that point. And Colt alum Elmira Louie, who helped me with the translations. And then Peg and Gina and Melissa and Eleanor and Alicia, who have also helped prepare the event today. And I'm reading out that list, and if I missed you, then I really apologize. But I'm reading out that list this afternoon, first of all, because thanks are absolutely due. And also because those thanks are also thematically to the point, and this is where I think you and I were sort of thinking along the same lines. Because actually this kind of generous donated labor is something that the myth of Amphion is about. It's one dimension of that myth's significance, because Amphion is a really complicated myth. But one thing the myth tells us is that as a species, human beings are stirred to collaborate, and in fact to take deep, sustaining pleasure in collective building, working together to make real and important things, for example, a book that advances knowledge in a given field or fields. So going back to Amphion. So that is what the myth of Amphion is about. We all happen to be very nice and very generous people, just as people. But we also contribute time, thought, and labor to the creation and production of big things. Things like knowledges or learning communities or generations of students who carry those knowledges forward so that society continues to thrive, because that's what colleagues do. That's what universities are for, instead of a lot of other stuff that they can suddenly seem to be about. And I'll just leave that line of thinking there, and I'll go on to say that the impulse to build things together, to build things cheerfully, because Amphion's art is a ludic art, it's a playful art, is something that the myth of Amphion describes. This myth also tells us that the structures Amphion's lyre inspires dismantle themselves. Those same energies that animate collaborative making also bring about conflict and destruction. Amphion inspires both. His patron is the trickster god, Hermes, or Mercury in Latin. And in the opening of my book, I point out that myths can't solve big problems or keep them from arising, but myths do keep us company. Okay, so who is Amphion? Amphion is the ancient king who played the lyre so sweetly and skillfully that the god Hermes, or in Latin Mercury, gave him a special one. When Amphion played it, great boulders were stirred to roll in from across the plain and stack themselves, building the mighty walls of Thebes. The second part of the story is that Amphion and his wife Niobe ruled over a successful city, but Niobe angered the goddess Latona, who sent her children Diana and Apollo is another god of poetry, to strike down Amphion's children one by one. The house of Amphion was destroyed. So that's who Amphion is. And one of the reasons I like this drawing, I like this particular illustration, is actually because you see Mercury here. He's kind of traced in. When I first found this image, I thought maybe it was sort of like an older image that possibly had been traced over and engraved over. But actually, I've seen enough images now of Amphion playing with someone behind him and directing his song, so I think this is actually what this drawing is about. So that's Mercury, the trickster god, who's his patron. Why does Amphion matter? When I first got started with this project, Amphion mattered because he helps us read great quantities of 16th and 17th century poetry, for which conventional poetic theory offers scant counsel. Not too far into the research, I saw that in fact, Amphion accounts for a lot more than that. But at the start, I had written my first book, Imperial Lyric, which is about the sonnet and the sonnet only, and how that one specific poetic form intersects with and helps establish the figure of the subject as the privileged modality of being in modernity. That is, I argued that the sonnet flourishes and attains hegemonic status in Renaissance early modernity because it is a song turned back on itself. It thus formally mirrors the self-reflective mental activity that is fundamental to subjectivation, or the production of subjects and their modes of agency. The sonnet and the modern subject take shape and reinforce one another in Renaissance writing and on through European-derived Western poetic tradition, which is also imperial tradition, which is why that first book is called Imperial Lyric. But in the aftermath of that book, I was keenly aware of all the varieties of poetry I had not addressed. I was spending a lot of time in the National Library of Spain, immersing myself in the massive quantities of verse that's held there, in bound volumes and loosed pages. Occasional lyrics, loose poems, reams of glosses, folios of academy and society proceedings, bound volumes of lyrics collated from submissions to one of the hundreds of thousands of poetry contests and tournaments sponsored in the 16th and 17th centuries by parishes, towns, abbeys, wealthy private citizens, and members of the nobility. The Spanish critic and literary scholar Aurora Ejido refers to the unscalable mountain of poems that such events have left to posterity. She does an excellent job of mapping that mountain and setting it into useful historical context by documenting, for example, how poetry competitions moved out of private Provençal court settings and into the public sphere in the 16th and 17th centuries. However, when it comes to actually reading those lyrics and other varieties of poésie de circonstance, engaging with them as poems, that is, as verbal artifacts, critics, even Ejido, for whom I have the greatest admiration, I always have to say, have little to say. And less patient and intellectually curious literary critics have tended to be dismissive of what Damaso Alonso describes as poems by those middling writers, those followers, those obscurantists, those who have nothing to say and no one to listen to their verses. So I found myself pondering, how do we make sense of this kind or of these kinds of poetry? How might I get non-subjective, not especially original or ingenious, but nonetheless deliberately crafted, measured language? How do I get those kinds of lyrics to speak to me? More important even, to speak to students, right? Because this is the majority of the poetry that we inherit from the Renaissance and early modern periods. And it seems strange indeed to overlook or dismiss it. And as I was turning over this question, I found myself thinking again and again of a rare set of lines that does seem to address the generative poetic power exercised by heaps and masses of lyric poems. I have the quotation up on a slide here, but the lines read, I'll just read you the English. Luis Perez Angel, you paragon of sound judgment, your ballads and sonnets build, as Amphion once did, for Thebes, walls for Arica, and Arica is a city that they're building in Peru, walls for Arica through the power of your conceits. So I had long been intrigued by that quotation because it points to a link between poetry and empire, between poetry making and building up a city on foreign soil. But what now came into view was Clarinda's image of great heaps of poems that do things by dint of their mass. Fragments of thoughts, attitudes, connections, and associations. The cultural material that generates compelling metaphors, conceits, or in Spanish, conceptos. These fragments pile up in a place, creating material bulwarks. And they also build abstract walls for something very real and solid in this world. A political formation, a polity, a city, a state, a colony, an empire. So Amphion, Lyre, Poetry and Politics in Modernity, demonstrates that Amphion is widely associated with the creation of all these political forms. And, as I said a moment ago, also their fated destruction. Lyrics, patterned language laced through with assonance and consonants, catch our minds and work on our bodies, drawing us into shared rhythms and perspectives. And Natalie Hester promised you some Cervantes. I'll read you the English. I have the Spanish up on the slide. Let's Yeah, this is one of my favorite examples of this, of how Amphion shows up in 16th and 17th century writing. This is Miguel de Cervantes' take on the Amphionic nature of the Habsburg imperial state in the 17th century. His satirical poem El Viaje del Parnaso, composed in 1614, begins as an old soldier is approached by the god Mercury, who requires help with a mission he had undertaken in service to Apollo. The sun god seeks to assemble an army of Spanish poets to combat a mysterious squadron that has risen up in the east. The soldier, whose fictional name is, of course, Miguel de Cervantes, is skeptical, but he agrees to discuss the mission on board Mercury's galleon. And upon boarding the ship, Cervantes is struck with wonder to find, and now I'm going to read you the English of what's up on the slide. From stem to stern, what a strange sight. It was fabricated entirely of verses, without one single line of prose. The mast of the ship is a canto, or an extended song composed in great verse, such as hendecasyllables or verso mayor or Alexandrines. The poop deck is composed of sonnets. The recujias, or the rails that lead from poop to prow, are fashioned of an extended elegy because, the speaker tells us, an elegy is the form in which one rails against misfortune. And I love it that I'm looking at Amanda Powell right now, because the way you teach elegy, I had the good fortune of actually observing Amanda Powell twice when she was teaching the elegy as a form. And I think of you whenever I write the word elegy. So these aren't really the kinds of elegies you were focusing on at the time, but still, I like it. Anyway, welcome. I'm glad you're here. So that's how one rails against misfortune, and so on. Cervantes compares the oars of the ship to estrúculos, an onomatopoetic poetic verse form that has a facility for speeding the movement of a poetic line. The parrels that attach the spars and the yards to the mast are made of redondillas, jocular, informal songs whose rhyme scheme rounds them off. Redondo means round in Spanish. And the suffix illa is a diminutive. So, I mean, it's such geniusy writing. The lyrics name thus suggests the circular shape of those rings. The sundry crew of the ship, the chusma, are native Castilian ballads, and I pulled that forward for you in yellow. Or romances, which is a very popular, sort of an omnipresent verse form in Spanish, very connected to Castilian identity. So romances, which are bold, according to Cervantes, bold, necessary, and can adapt themselves to any purpose. This ingenious catalog displays Cervantes' comprehensive knowledge of Castilian and Italian lyrics, a knowledge he fuses with his equally thorough grasp of how a ship works, because Cervantes spent 4 years in the Spanish Navy, and he wrote great quantities of lyrics over the course of his career, so this is informed, and this is right at the end of his life. He's been thinking about these things for years. But note also that Mercury's allegorical galleon is built, like Amphion's walls, of lyrics and people, interchangeably. The chusma, or the sundry crew, who make the great vessel run. And since the Spanish Habsburg Empire extended throughout the globe and all around the Mediterranean, it makes sense that he'd substitute a ship for Amphion's walls. George Puttenham also does a good job of explaining why and how lyric generates political forms. Writing to Queen Elizabeth I in 1589, Puttenham remarks that the poet makes and contrives out of his own brain both the verse and the matter of his poem. And he offers a variety of sources for the poet's ability to do that. Platonic furor, an innate excellence of nature, great subtlety of spirit and wit, much experience and observation of the world, or he allows probably all or part or most of these factors. What I'm interested in especially is Puttenham's emphasis on materiality and on lived experience. He makes specific claims for a human creative capacity that is lodged in the brain and not, for example, in the soul. And it's also informed by local conditions. That is, like many theorists of his time, Puttenham speaks of poetry's capacities to communicate the core truths and the fundamental laws of nature to humankind. But this communication is successful when poets bring truths to life for their communities by using language that appeals to them in body and mind. So he talks about how, speech by meter, a kind of utterance, is more cleanly couched and more delicate to the ear than prose is. The effective meters and rhythms are socially and culturally inflected. Puttenham writes that poesy is a skill appertaining to utterance, and that just as the ancient poets worked with rules, grammars, and sonorous properties of Greek and Latin, English poets can work with 20 other curious points of the English language to create rhyme, tunable concords, and symphony to draw people into motion, as Amphion once did. Amphion built up cities and reared walls with the sound of his harp, figuring thereby the mollifying of hard and stony hearts by his sweet and eloquent persuasion. Implicit here in Putnam's explanation, and also in the metaphor of Amphion's walls, is the recognition that poetic devices not only include, but they have the power to set people outside the circle of belonging, when they are not stirred, for example, or when they are stirred differently, perhaps, or when they are somehow prevented from responding. So Clorinda, Cervantes, and Puttenham are not unique in the interest they take in Amphion. Here I have just a few more examples of the numerous Renaissance writers who cite Amphion as a figure for the nature, purpose, and social and political value of lyric poetry. You may be noticing that the name of Amphion appears in these passages paired with the name of Orpheus. Amphion's myth arrives to 16th and 17th century writers via Euripides, Ovid, and Horace. And it is Horace's Ars Poetica that furnishes the basis for, in fact, the entire concept of lyric, conceived of as a discrete subset, a discrete kind within poetry that is, a future genre when people start thinking and writing in terms of genre. But right now, people talk about kinds. But it's Horace really who establishes the basis for that. And the passage that everyone is drawing from, really well into the 19th century, and it still shows up in books on poetics, is this passage from the Horace's Ars Poetica, or it's also called the Epistola ad Pisones. In this passage, Horace talks about Musa lyrae solers. I pulled that in yellow for you here. Musa lyrae solers, so songs of the lyric muse. And he talks about it as a specific kind of poetry, one that he carves out of a larger domain that includes epic, hymns of praise, odes, all that great poetry composed by the ancient Greeks. But Horace says that Romans, occupied as they are with war and commerce, don't have the time or the training to write that kind of poetry. What Romans can succeed at is a different art. And it's minor in scope compared to the Greeks, but socially it's actually quite useful, as it orders and accompanies the practices fundamental to harmonious and productive social life. It keeps society operating smoothly as people carry out their assigned roles in established rhythms. And that's one point I think that matters to lyric tradition more broadly, and it disappears when lyric is redefined in the 19th and 20th centuries as a discourse of the self, and the person who writes about that the most is Virginia Jackson, right, with Yogi Prince. In the Lyric Theory Reader. So in some ways, my ambition for Amphion, should this ever happen, is I would love Amphion to be the prequel, right, to the Lyric Theory Reader and to Dickinson's Misery, because I think I'm telling the first half of the story that Jackson and Prince pick up. We'll see. Review the book. Right? So this is one point that matters, I think, to lyric tradition more broadly, and it disappears from view when lyric is redefined in the 19th and 20th centuries as a discourse of the self. But consider the Happy Birthday song, or the Alphabet Song, or holiday carols, all those little rhymes and ditties that help keep cultural rituals alive. Amphion's lyre is still an active instrument. We have just stopped talking about it for the most part in the field of poetry and poetics. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, lyric's function was the object of critical fascination. And another of my favorite quotations in this book is from Luis de Zapata, who prepared a Castilian language translation of Horace's Ars Poetica. And he just was like raving in the introduction And he says, listen, this book is useful for poets, for orators, for preachers, for historians. It is useful for writing and speaking, for how to treat people, and how to learn differences between people, between states, between nations, between ages, and just ultimately for everything. I agree. So just a couple more points about Horace's theory of lyric, Musa Lyrae Solers. Orpheus and Amphion don't intersect in Greek tradition. Horace selects them from the numerous sponsors the ancient Greeks attributed to various kinds of song. Linus, Musaeus, Sappho. The Greeks attributed the invention of many poem forms to specific ancient figures, and then from that catalog, Horace singles out just these two, Orpheus and Amphion. And he uses those two myths to mark out a sphere of particularly and uniquely human making, a sphere of lyric poiesis. And that's what distinguishes lyrics from, for example, epic or divine hymn, that are channeled. They come from the divine and they're channeled through human voices. But the lyre is an instrument that human beings wield, human beings play. And its products, be they songs or polities, are human created, if divinely inspired and assisted. And then within this category of Musa Lyrae Solers, or lyric, Horace privileges two functions. And one of them is pretty familiar, right? It's the Orphic, which manifests the power and the tragic limitations of the solitary human voice. That power that almost defeats death, and which is preserved in human writing. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. That's Shakespeare sonnet 18, but it's also Orpheus. But then there's also the Amphionic included in this category, and the Amphionic in contrast represents something quite different. Our impulse not to Orphic solitude and the I-you relation, but to collaboration, as I mentioned a little earlier. The fact that each one of us contains within ourselves the capacity to be roused to common purpose, to contribute enthusiastically to the creation of a works in progress or a books in print session, or to the creation of a polity, in this case a productive community secured by walls that certainly may be physical, as in the case of ancient Thebes, but which are also, as I indicated earlier, abstract. Patterns of attitudes, routines, practices, and beliefs held in common as interior, weight-bearing walls that form the enabling conditions, the epistemological and ontological envelopes in which a given metaphor makes sense to us, and particular rhythms and rhyme schemes stir us and delight us. So what is truly poetic about the Amphionic art is co-making itself. Aurélie Delattre and Adeline Leonetto prepared a very good collection of essays on French poésie de circonstance from the Renaissance to the 20th century. And they point out in the introduction that the point of occasional poetry is not necessarily the poems that are generated in response to a particular prompt. Rather, it is this spirit of enthusiastic consensus to take action, to make something together, that a poetry contest or a parlor game challenges and awakens. Oren Eisenberg says something similar in a book I admire very much called Being Numerous. He writes in that book that poetry is not always and everywhere understood as a literary project aiming to produce a special kind of verbal artifact, distinguished by its particular formal qualities or by its distinctive uses of language. Nor is it always understood as an aesthetic project seeking to provoke or promote a special kind of experience of transformative beauty, for example, or imaginative freedom. For a certain type of poet, poetry represents a civilizational wish, and that's the Amphionic wish, although as always, because it's mercurial, it's also ambivalent, right? And I'm almost done with what I'm going to say. But because what Amphion's lyre creates, its poiesis, is a feeling, a stirring, the inspiration to collective action, his poetry is, in a sense, ephemeral. It is alive, and then it dies, either in a slow fade or abruptly in some kind of political rupture. The walls Amphion builds are not the walls of Athens or Corinth, they're the walls of Thebes. and Thebes is the paradigmatic city of political disaster. And some of us here in this room might be thinking, when I'm talking about Amphion, that the Amphion, shows up in Joachim du Bellay in the Antiquité de Rome when he's thinking about civil war. Or, of course, we may be thinking about Dante, who says that it's Amphionic meters that build the walls of hell, again, thinking about civil war. So that's where Amphion and Orpheus share ground. Their capacities are wondrous, but they are still limited by the laws that govern the human and the physical world, and they die. Orpheus makes an art out of failure, and that art becomes the basis for much of what goes on to be recognized as lyric tradition. In the case of Amphion, lyrics and verbal fragments produced by the workings of his lyre, for example, those heaps of poems, that unscalable mountain I mentioned at the start of this talk, that we have so much trouble getting to make sense to us today, those poems often become simply byproducts, the material remains of something that no longer exists, a collective, productive goodwill that has since died out. So when we approach this poetry, the questions that we are usually trained to bring to lyrics, for example, is this a lyric poem? I mean, that's like the number one thing you ask in poetry classes. Like, is this a poem? Right? And then, is it a good poem? Right? But those questions actually don't work very well when you're trying to begin to get a handle on Amphionic poetry. Instead, these poems tend to open up when we ask, did this poem build something? And what were the conditions and the situations in which it was generative? In other words, in which it sang. So those are the basic premises of the book. My chapters explore how different writers used Amphion as a point of reference or a guiding principle that shapes lyric poetics. And the center of gravity and the emphasis in the book is on the 16th and 17th centuries. But as an early modernist, I'm always curious about what happens in the 16th century that we're still living today. And I have set up these chapters so that they move in a kind of a dialogue where I'll be working in the pre and the early modern. And then in the later portions of the chapter, we'll see where some of these phenomena that I've picked forward make themselves known and felt in more recent writing. So chapter 1 is about participatory making and the prosodies that writers identified with Amphionic powers in England, France, Spain, and the Spanish Americas. And I also in that chapter talk some about activity that many theorists of poetry will either marginalize entirely or else discuss as lyric adjacent activities such as glossing and translation, and a few other kinds of writing that I would view as, in fact, lyric production, but which often don't get read or talked about because until you really figure out a way to read them, they are mind-bendingly tedious, right? Once you get in there, they're like, oh no, this is beautiful, this is wonderful. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is about both translation and the translatio of Amphionic lyric poetics. Here, very specifically, I talk about empire-building poetics across French and British tradition. The chapter concludes with a reading of a 2014 sequence by the Irish writer Trevor Joyce, who has a post-colonial take on a sequence that I know as the Antiquité de Rome, and many people know as the ruins of Rome. It depends on whether you first encounter it with Du Bellay or with Spencer. And what's interesting about what Trevor Joyce does when he decides that he's going to translate that sequence into modern English in 2014 is, under the austerity measures imposed in Ireland in the wake of the crash of the Celtic tiger, he only uses monosyllables. Right? He can make wonderful poetry out of monosyllables, so it's a really great exercise in Amphionic reading and writing. Chapter 3 opens with the Cervantes poem I talked about a little bit earlier and uses that as a point of departure to talk about poetry in heaps and stacks. And I talk about the explosion of poetry contests across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. And I raise the issue of Amphionic labor relations. I think implicit in everything I'm telling you about Amphion building the walls for Thebes and the stones just rolling from the plain and they stack themselves. I mean, That's a king's view of how cities get built, right? And what's interesting about poetry contests is actually many people who convene poetry contests and sponsor them are in fact going to take all the poetry that's written in those contests and bind it in expensive bindings and then give it to a patron to receive political favors. So there's a real extractivist logic here that everyone is aware of too. I mean, the interesting thing is that those people who make those collections and deliver them to their patrons are quite specific about what they're doing. It's very interesting. So I talk about that in chapter 3. And then finally, chapter 4, Amphion in the Americas. That was actually the hardest chapter to write. It discusses the extraordinary salience of the Amphion myth in the Spanish colonial imaginary. The myth informs Spanish coloniality, the myth of Amphion, informs Spanish coloniality in 2 ways. First, writers such as Bernardo de Balbuena in Mexico and Amaryllis in Peru compare Cortés and the Peruvian conquistadores with Amphion. As those conquistadores tear apart the indigenous civilizations they encounter to build new shining cities that conform to the divine order of the Christian heaven. And Amphion, especially Balbuena, really goes into detail about comparing Cortés to Amphion in that respect. Second, the writers adopt the Dantean canto and terza rima as the favored verse form in which to write about the wonders of their newly founded worlds and societies. And some writers, notably Balbuena, seem to recognize the link Dante drew between Amphionic poetics and hell. And I have here, this is where Dante talks about Amphion in Canto 32 of the Inferno. And he says, let those ladies, that is the muses, let those muses aid my verses who helped Amphion enclose Thebes, so that the word may not be different from the fact. And he describes what Amphionic poetics would look like by talking about harsh and clacking rhymes, such as befit the dreadful hole toward which all other rocks point. So this idea, this tension between the sort of beautiful flowing terza rima and then the concept of harsh and clacking rhymes is something that it looks like Balbuena is thinking about. And then later in the chapter, it's certainly something that Raúl Zurita is thinking about when he uses Dante as the basis for the jagged, harsh poetry he uses to write about the predations of the Pinochet regime. So on that happy note, the book does end happily because I talk about Mapuche poets who are appropriating canonical Anglophone poetry to build new kinds of structures in their own language. So we end on an upbeat note. But I just want to thank you for your attention. If you feel like talking about anything, then I'd be delighted to talk about it. If you want to just eat snacks, what did you have in mind?
Would you entertain some questions?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and I'm happy to talk about anything in the chapters or anything I said. Yes.
I actually do have a small question
Yep.
that I'm just curious about Amphion's instrument.
Mm-hmm.
Because you mentioned somewhere in the book that in some 16th and 17th century artwork, it's not always the lyre, sometimes it's like another kind of instrument, but it's always a stringed instrument, and that's super important. I guess I just wasn't sure if I was understanding correctly. Is it because it's the string that vibrates and stirs the air as compared to like woodwinds? It's the air column that vibrates? Like, why is that important?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for reading the book. That makes me feel so happy. So it's a stringed instrument because a string can break. And so when Alciato uses sort of a lyre zither mix in the Emblemata Liber, he uses that to represent diplomacy. The political pact. And he has an image of a stringed instrument. And he says that that political peace is as hard to achieve as tuning a stringed instrument, and that the second one string is out of tune or a string breaks altogether, everything falls apart. And I think that that idea is informing how Amphion gets represented in those images. Thanks for that question. Yes?
So I was just wondering if there's any invocation of biblical images, especially David and his lyre, in this literature.
I haven't seen David connected to Amphion, but we certainly see David connected to Orpheus a lot. And my sense about Amphion is if people do get interested in him, and I would love it if they do, think of how much writing there is about Orpheus. Amphion can take that much, right? Because he's half of lyric tradition. He's just the half we don't talk about. And I think already I have a friend in Mexico, at UNAM, who's been sending me, apparently Amphion has an active career in Jesuit pedagogy. Right? So now she's like, oh, that's who that is. It's who she's been finding him. So along those lines, I'm wondering if perhaps we'll get some, because it seems natural, right? Because Orpheus really is, he plays the lyre, but the big thing about Orpheus is his voice. But Amphion is absolutely about playing the instrument. So yeah, if you find it, let me know. Joyce, yeah?
Thank you so much. I feel humbled because I didn't know who this figure Amphion, and as you said, Orpheus is so much more famous. They both play the lyre, right? So my understanding of that is because they have to sing while they're playing that. So going back to your question, if they play the flute, they wouldn't be able to sing.
I should have thought of it.
So the flute is a mythic instrument as well. So I kept, just wondering why is it that I know so, as a modernist, 19th, 20th century stuff, Orpheus is everywhere, but Amphion is not, and I think it makes me feel like there's some injustice here, and this is actually really, really interesting. But this is a bad question for someone who hasn't read the book, but the way I would say, the reason why we, in a way, love Orpheus or fetishize Orpheus is because of that tragic dimension, right? Both the descent into hell and then also the way he was torn apart, and then the relationship with Dionysus, right? So the Nietzsche, we just love this stuff and, kind of canonical modernism. But the idea that he gets torn apart, it comes to nothing. So this poetry, the poetics, does not ever form in a kind of gestalt, right? Like word never becomes fact. So it's always word. In fact, it's music. It's even pre-word. So I think if I take like a philosophical reading of that, I would say in the case of Orpheus, music and poetry belong very undreified, and it remains in the realm of action, right? So that's the third part of vita activa, human condition, according to Hannah Arendt. But what is so interesting about your figure, Amphion, is that it does not do that. It actually, the music, the poem, created something like fact, right? It's an artifact. It's not immaterial. It was so amazing that it moves stones. It can construct a city. So that moves into the realm of homo faber, which is the second realm of vita activa, according to Hannah Arendt. And I just wonder if, I don't know why that makes I don't know if it's related to the fact that we're, modernists have been less interested in Amphion, but I think you make a really compelling case in the sense of that, like maybe we have more to learn from Amphion in terms of how something that is action can get reified, and then the violence that comes with that, right? So like, Hannah Arendt is very ambivalent toward the realm of homo faber, the sense that humans can make everything, yay, but then, yes, they can make everything. They can turn everything into making. So we can remake the planet, we can remake ourselves, we can remake everything, right? So it's the transition from action into making, right? From to act versus to make, that I think is probably the key to why your figure is so important, and for modernity. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that, and I'm glad. Thank you for everything you just said. Paul Valéry actually has one of his light comedies, and it's called Amphion. And it's so close to what you're describing right now. And so when I read it, I was like, this is not Amphion, this is Norfolk, dude. But I said, no, this is like totally Orphic, because the other thing about Amphion is that he's always involved in collectives. I mean, I didn't go into this because we didn't have time, but Amphion is actually not one person, he's a twin. He's got a brother who's the heavy worker. We don't know the name of his brother, Zethus. We just know the name of Amphion. But Paul Valery has this really good comedy that you might want to take a look at. That's musical and is about building a temple and breaking it down. Right, I know you had a question.
Well, actually, Joyce kind of
okay.
asked a lot of what I was going to ask. Thank you for this. I did read the introduction of your book at some point. I was really taken by it. And then, in general, just really taken by kind of the pragmatic dimensions that you're looking at. And we've almost talked about this as practical lyric, right? Lyric that does things. And I love the invocation of J.L. Austin with how to do things.
Yeah.
And I guess, I love that slide where you say, what kind of questions do we ask our students about literature, rather than the object of literature, rather than asking this question, what does it do? What does it do to us? What does it do for us? And I was wondering maybe we could talk a little bit more about what does it mean, what kind of opportunities that can give us in the ways that we teach literature, and then we try to make a case for the relevance of literature when this might help us rethink.
This is my favorite question. Thank you. I'm so excited. I'm teaching a fall poetry course. I've been doing this for a while, but I just went all in this time. So the course on poetry I'm teaching in the fall is genuinely half practicum. I mean, we're going to be doing a lot of reading. We're going to be doing some, of course you're nodding, right? Because your classes are very much about this as well, yes. We're going to be doing a fair amount of reading, and we're going to learn about different poetic forms, but we're always also going to be making poetry. And I have known for like a long time that when I teach poetry, the best thing to do is to have the students write a sonnet. That just helps everything. But this time we're going to do all of it. We're going to do like free verse, we're going to do a villanelle, the students we're working with these days are makers. They want to be the makers anyway, right? So I have a lot of confidence actually in how this class will go. I hope it enrolls. That will be a thing. But the other reason that I'm committed to teaching the class is because I think actually everybody really needs this now. I think we are just so digitaled out that I also think that people, this is a good time to be thinking about poetry and just about the materiality of language and getting our bodies and our minds involved in the reading that we do. So I think that that's another place where we have a lot of opportunity as people who work with literature. But I wonder also if you had thoughts about that, about your own sort of ways of thinking about literature and teaching.
I'm not under a cloud of despair about whether or not we'll survive the next 50 years, but absolutely, how do we make literature a real practice? I come from an uneducated working class background. I got a PhD in literature. I try to tell my working class students this is important. This is meaningful. This is structuring. This matters, right? How do we reinforce that message in a public school like ours? The civic importance of
so thanks so much, Leah. It's so interesting. I'm wondering, and I already sent you this reference to one of the other Amphion references in Horace, but I'm wondering if it appears elsewhere in the literature that you're presenting here, and that's namely not Amphion as the productive poet, but actually Amphion as the brother who falls silent, who stops playing the lyre in order to keep the peace. And that occurs in an epistle of Horace where he is giving advice to a young protege, like somebody who's going to attach himself to a patron. And he's basically saying, if you want to keep your patron happy, if he wants to do something, you just fall into line with him. And then Horace refers to Amphion and Zethus as an analogy. So it's like this very opposite activity, a much more negative exemplum in terms of Amphion. And so I'm just wondering if, I mean, it's much less famous, obviously, than the
Right, it would be.
Poetica,
Right,
and yet
right.
it's still there, and also very resonant in the context of the civil wars of the first century BCE. So, yeah, I'm just curious whether it appears elsewhere in the literature that you're addressing.
I have not seen that yet, but I do wonder, just when I was finishing, just when I was finishing the book, I was looking more at the Pléiade, and they have some, the French Pléiade group, they have some court entertainments, and Pierre Ronsard would talk about Amphion playing his guitar. And so it was sort of satirical and light, but I think also the context leads me to think that that might be, like, in that set of sort of, that group of poems, I might find something along those lines. That would seem like a place. And then another, in Plato's Gorgias, the tension, so he spends time talking about the tension between Amphion and Zethus, and that dialogue is not resolved. The question of, do you act, so Zethus is the strong man, and Amphion and Zethus have a dispute. They learn that their mother has been violated and mistreated, and they want to avenge her, and so they're going to go storm Thebes and kill the people who have brought her to grief. And so Zethus is all in for, like, let's kill him, right? And Amphion is like, no, we will show them the error of their ways, right? And in the Gorgias, there's a tension between which is the way to go, like muscular violence or sweet eloquence, and that never quite gets resolved. So I think that is also a place where early modern writers could find a different view of Amphion. The examples I've seen the most are either that he's the builder, or else that he's just tearing everything apart.
I think I share your taste for what we could call the poetic leftovers that never get to be enjoyed, whether there are poetry contests, glosses, translations, ephemera, all of this incredible amount of production. And I think what you do so well is to sort of bring that up to remind us that, there is a certain elitism to having forms of literature emerge and be fetishized or put up there, but in fact, this mass of production is very, it's participatory, and so I think that's what you uncover and you discover, and I think that's a great reminder of that. That's why I think the class, also to have that sort of understanding of literature as a participatory process, as opposed as to selecting the best, the most, the finest, or is I think a good reminder. And so I feel like Amphion has that sort of ambivalent nation building aspect that we must be aware of, but the other aspect to me would be sort of more of an anti-elitist type of sort of participatory process, which I think is what you really bring out.
It's fun. I mean, when you're reading for Amphion, it's, just some poems where the first time you look at them, if you're me, because I can be like kind of a snooty pants, and the first time you look at them, I'm just like, that is the dumbest rhyme I have ever seen. Like, that one is really a stretch, right? But then you're like, but, like, it's funny. And 2 days later, I can still completely remember it. Like, it's doing its work, right? And then you also, that sort of leads me to think about how much fun it was. Like, especially in the poetry contest, the invitations to write poetry are written in the most charming fashion. And these goofball metaphors, and they always have prizes, or most of them have prizes attached, right? So if you write the best poem about St. Vincent Ferrer, you will receive a topaz set in gold, because St. Vincent Ferrer's life was a topaz set in gold. And you're like, but it's adorable, right? And then 800 people send a poem, right? And they enjoyed writing the poem. So I think that is just so important to remember. I was talking to someone else and I said it's kind of like Yelp reviews or like TripAdvisor. Like, think of all the content we generate just because it's like fun to like review, right? And then we send it all to the platform.
It also reminds me of like when people would write poems to each other for their birthdays
Yeah.
or albums.
Yeah.
Just this whole idea that a poem can be like a gift, a fun thing, and it's very social.
Yeah.
So, and if your class sounds like we'll
Yeah.
recreate that. Maybe everyone should have an album, and then someone should write.
Oh yeah, no. We're going like everyone gets like a spiral Mead notebook with a pocket in it where they put their phone. Right. Yeah, we're going very, very old school.
But anyway,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think that capturing that whole social aspect is very interesting and non-elitist. You're right.
Oh, yeah.
Just a very small
Yeah.
question, because you mentioned the romance being a very specific genre in Castilian. Did they sing this? Or
Yeah.
not? They did sing it.
Mhm.
Because I was looking at Taylor Swift lyrics for some totally different, and I thought they didn't look very, just on paper, they didn't look very compelling, because, a lot of my students really like her, and so I thought, I want to understand, why, and everybody said her lyrics are amazing, so I looked at it, and it was not that impressive on the paper. But then I have to remind myself that she sang this. It's all sung, so it's different when you
Right.
sing it, right? So
Right.
yeah. So romance is like canciones. It's just
It's like ballads.
Okay.
Yeah. And they're super important because so many of them talk about like, the Christian conquest of the peninsula. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
If you have, I don't
Yeah,
know.
of course, yeah.
You've been standing for a while, but I was just wondering if you could say a little bit, I'm just thinking of the chapter 2, but just about the role of translation in relation to, the questions or comments from one poetic vernacular to the other, context to the other, and where Amphion is in relation to translation. So I also, because your readings are so beautiful in those different contexts. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And I think that the thing, something that's just so noticeable about especially 16th century, I think, debates about language and poetry is that verse form was a national identity that so much depended upon, not the red girl, but whether or not you worked in that 8-syllable line, right? And if you did, you were a certain kind of person, right? You were an old aristocrat. You probably had entirely Christian blood up to your family in Leon or whatever. But if you worked in an 11-syllable line, you were a rebel. Right? And you liked Italians, right? And you wanted to be like Italians, and that was a total betrayal to everything Castilian, right? So and it was really serious stuff. Courtiers got demoted, right? So that was a big deal. I think it's also an important point in the French. I don't think that the French debates are quite as vicious as the Spanish ones, but it still really matters, Are you going to work in the shorter line? Are you going to embrace this new reformed French? So in the 16th century, the question of poetic vocabulary and rhetoric was just very fraught and charged. There's a scholar up at Reed, whose name is Lucia, I can't remember her last name, who writes a lot about what it meant to start incorporating iambic pentameter into English miscellanies and collections of verse, and then to make a move to establish iambic pentameter as the classic line in the English language. And that was not, when I learned that, it was just, it happened in the Renaissance and it was one and done. But no, it was entirely fraught. It really had a lot to do with your religious practice, with your social class. So all of this to say that when you're translating between languages, the decision about how to translate one verse form into another language is a very fraught decision. And there's at least one case I know about, which poor Lainey and Fabienne have read like 7 versions of this argument. But there is a debate about how to translate a French poem called
Chevalier de Libéré.
There you go. See, she knows. Right, the Chevalier de Libéré. Are you going to use an 8-syllable Spanish line or an 11-syllable Spanish line? And it's a huge debate. And whether it's related to the poetic debate or not, the person who chose the 11-syllable line gets accused of sodomy and investigated by the Inquisition and disappears from court. We never hear from him again. I don't know if it was because he was not a satisfactory poet or whether there was some other beef, but he came from a very good family, so a well-placed family.
The
So
Italian sin.
exactly, it sat there, right? And the Orphic sin, right? Someone's like, oh, he's a bad Orpheus. So that sort of adds angst and also heft to the translation debates.
All right.
Thank you all so much. Our research notes segment helps us keep current on recent developments in University of Oregon faculty and student research. In this episode, Lowell Bowditch tells us about her book, Roman Love Elegy and the Eros of Empire, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2023. Lowell Bowditch is a professor and department head of classics at the University of Oregon. Her research explores the interface between the literature and socio-political relations of Augustan Rome. Lowell Bowditch, welcome.
Thank you so much, Leah. And thank you for inviting me to talk about my book. I'm very excited to be interviewed.
Well, we are delighted. How would you describe your research focus?
So broadly speaking, and I guess I will include and embrace here my research focus for the entire time that I've been here, so including both my first book and this book and, handfuls of articles in between, is, as you described, looking at the interpenetration of socioeconomic discourses and socioeconomic context and the literature itself. So for my first book, which I won't dwell on, but I will mention, that had to do with patronage in ancient Rome, and specifically literary patronage under the first Emperor Augustus. And I looked at the ways in which a discourse of gift exchange, which I partly appropriated from anthropological theory, but I felt it was very relevant to ancient Rome. I looked at the way in which that allowed us to see what was going on in terms of the exchanges between Horace and the regime, and the way in which poetry itself becomes a gift with obviously propagandistic and persuasive purposes, and how freedom is also negotiated by the poet within that gift exchange construct. So that's was my first book. So research focus there, socioeconomic backdrop of patronage and the poetry. And for this book on Love Elegy in ancient Rome, I look at, again, discourses, but here the discourses are those of imperialism and the fact that Love Elegy has traditionally been interpreted, Roman Love Elegy, that is, has traditionally been interpreted as a bit of a resistant genre, that is to say, a genre that critiques and resists the increasing monarchism and autocracy of the Augustan government and all that it is demanding. However, what I look at is, in fact, I try to defamiliarize the genre and look at the ways in which imperialist discourses are woven nonetheless into the genre so that it can't really escape being a product of Augustan power and also communicating Augustan power. So that's my research focus, and I can talk more, well, I can talk more about the book, but I do want to draw attention to the fact that the period of Augustan Rome is uh, very productive of uh, the literature of the time, I think. I mean, that is to say, I think one of the reasons why there is this huge efflorescence of literature. We see Virgil's Aeneid, we see Horace's Odes, we see Latin Love Elegy, we see a little bit later Ovid. I think it partly has to do not just with patronage, and indeed there was that, but also it's a transitional period. So it's a transitional period from the late Republic to the Empire. And it is very significant in the case of Latin Love Elegy that this is a genre that literally comes into being at the very end of the 30s BCE. So essentially, at the time that Octavian, who later becomes Augustus, defeats Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium, uh, it is around this time that we start seeing the first Roman love elegies, as that genre is defined, come into being. And then it really falls away with the end of the Augustan Empire, so, or the end of Augustus's regime. So it's quite fascinating that for all that the genre presents itself as a very private genre having to do with the relationship between the poet lover and his beloved, in fact, it is something that comes into being with a new form of power as it is transitioning to monarchical power. And once that transition has been made, it actually begins to fade away. So that's just by way of background.
That's just completely fascinating. And yes, my next question was about the book. So, how do you interpret that sort of coterminous relationship between Roman love elegy and the Augustan Empire?
Yeah. So what I look at, and first, before I actually mention the specific discourses of
Hmm.
imperialism that I look at, just a little bit of background on the genre itself. So,
That's great.
yeah, so as it's defined, um, and again, it's very specifically Roman love elegy, even though the meter had been around, like elegiac meter had been around, the one line of dactylic hexameter followed by an elegiac pentameter. That meter had been around, and we also see Catullus, who is a very famous Roman love poet, of course. We see him writing in that meter, but we don't actually see love elegy proper until Tibullus, Propertius, and Ovid. Those are our three canonical love elegies. And it's defined, sort of broadly speaking, by its first person narrator, the poet lover, the poet amator, who's in love with a beloved. Generally speaking, a female, although there are a few poems by Tibullus addressed to a male. But generally speaking, it's a heterosexual, erotic attraction. And of course, for it to be productive of poetry, it is not generally consummated, although sometimes it is. And it is defined also by two features, namely the mistress is masculinized and the poet is feminized. And that has partly to do with the fact that the mistress is presented as having much more power, erotically speaking, over the poet who has less power. And that, of course, is a total inversion of the actual socioeconomic backdrop of these figures, because the poet would have been an elite male and the beloved would have been it seems the poetry presents her, generally speaking, as a courtesan, so someone who had been a slave and is now a freed woman who supports herself through her relationships as a courtesan/prostitute. So that's kind of the background of the players in Roman Love Elegy. But what you also see is it's shot through with references to foreign lands, with references to luxury goods, with references to statuary, Greek statuary, with references to military triumph. So there are these different discourses, references to, or discourses of imperialism and references to the phenomena of imperialist conquest. And so I look at 5 instances of this. So I have a chapter on luxury goods. I have a chapter on Egypt. I have a chapter on the mistress as she intersects with a discourse of cartography. So, of course, map making is becoming more of a thing during this time. So that's 3 chapters. I have a 4th chapter on the figure of Isis, and then I have another chapter on the figure of, the chapter on Egypt proper is also a chapter on Osiris. So I have Osiris at the beginning, Isis at the end, and then the mistress, the triumph, and cartography as the 3 chapters in between the book ending of Egypt chapters, as it were. And I look at how a post-colonialist critique of these imperialist discourses can help us understand how Rome is deeply ambivalent about her relationship to provinces. So Egypt being the most recent province, it becomes a province after Octavian defeats Mark Antony, and Greece, of course, has been a province for quite a while, but Rome is still deeply ambivalent about Greece, and the very famous Latin phrase of Graecia capta ferum victorem capit, captive Greece took her victor captive, that suggests, is very evocative of Rome's ambivalence about being culturally dominated by Greece, even though Rome had militarily conquered Greece. And that particular phrase is very instrumental to me in my explorations of those attitudes towards Greece. Yeah, and I can go on if you want to ask me leading questions or not.
Well, I'm hanging on every word, as you can imagine. But I was interested in your response to our 3rd question on these research notes segments, which is, what makes this work you've done on Augustan Rome important to humanity?
Yeah, so I think I thought about that question, and I came back to the notion of ambivalence, because I think that ambivalence is a human condition, and it the arts, through which we express ourselves, the attitudes that we have towards the systems by which we run our communities and our lives, government systems and familial systems, and everything in between. I feel that it's all, in fact, shot through with ambivalence. We are very ambivalent about, we have a split country, for example, right now. And so I think that by looking at the way in which Roman writers and Roman literature displays ambivalence with regard to its particular condition at that time, as it is transitioning from the late Republic to the monarchy of the emperors, I think that allows us to better understand ourselves as humans who experience ambivalence in so many different ways. And just to go back to the period of Augustus, the ambivalence is in part because they have just come through a century of very bloody civil wars. And so, despite the fact that the rise of Augustus really did mean decreasing freedoms, there was some thankfulness for that. And please don't read anything into that statement with regard to our own political and cultural moment. But with regard to that literature, you do see that ambivalence. You see that, oh my goodness, we're watching all of these freedoms being taken away from us on the one hand, and on the other hand, we are somewhat grateful for peace having been established. And I feel, there is a similar ambivalence, or a different type of ambivalence in the Love Elegy. There is that, but there is also this ambivalence about Greece, for example, right? There's this absolute admiration for everything culturally that it represents to Rome. They imitate the Greeks, they appropriate the Greeks, they transform Greek art and literature, and yet there's also this high degree of anxiety that they are actually being dominated by Greece. So I think we see ambivalence everywhere, and I think that is one reason why this is important to our humanity. Yeah.
It seems like such a useful point to bring forward right now to, so often reflections on the imposition of imperial structures break into binaries. You're for it or against it, right? You're profiting and privileged, or you're oppressed. And so introducing ambivalence, I think, is just going to be such a useful mechanism through which to look at empires and, what they proffer and what they take away. So I look forward to reading the book. Where can we learn more about these topics?
Yeah, so I did make a list of books, and I would say, in terms of Love Elegy, you can find more in a Blackwell companion to Love Elegy that has a collection of various essays on the genre. Clearly, as you know, the godfather, as it were, of post-colonialism is Edward Said's work, both Orientalism and culture and imperialism. There are critiques about using that lens to think about the literature of antiquity, but in any case, I won't go into all of that because I realize we're probably at time very soon, but that's another two books. There's a woman, Nancy Shumate, and she wrote Nation Empire Decline, Studies in Rhetorical Continuity from the Romans to the Modern Era. And her work was very instrumental and enlightening to me with regard to how to look at Roman literature from a post-colonial or through a post-colonial lens, and she, takes on all the charges of anachronism, and so I found her work extremely useful. She does look at the more kind of obvious instances of, or at least overtly textual instances of the template that Roman texts provided for modern or for early modern or modern literature as it is engaging with colonialist enterprise, or imperialism. Yeah, so and then on the Augustan period in general, there's a book by Karl Galinsky, Augustan Culture, and his edited volume, The Cambridge Companion to the Age of Augustus, and then two other books, finally. One is, hold on. Oh, wait, I'm not being, this is not, I was going to show it up like show and tell, but I won't do that.
This is only audio.
Yes, this is only audio, exactly. Just imagine this book, right? There's a book by Andrew Wallace Hadrill called Rome's Cultural Revolution. And so that's a brilliant book. And also there's a book by Anthony Spawforth called Greece and the Augustan Cultural Revolution. So lots of revolution here. finally, I would say you could consult the book edited by Lore, MacDonald, and Paideia Peralta called Rome, Empire of Plunder, The Dynamics of Cultural Appropriation. So all of those are excellent, avenues into the period and some of these issues that I'm talking about. Yeah.
Thank you so much for these references.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I've been speaking with Lowell Bowditch, professor and department head of classics at the University of Oregon. UO Today is a production of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Thanks for listening.